morning, everyone. This is Maury Galbraith with the Western Interstate Energy Board. Welcome to the WIEB webinar on the role of coal in the West. The work presented today was completed as part of a summer internship program between Stanford University and the Western Interstate Energy Board. Benjamin Lim is a graduate student at Stanford University in the Civil and Environmental Engineering program. And Max Vigales is a recent graduate of Stanford who is headed to MIT in the fall to pursue a PhD in social engineering systems. So we were really pleased to have Max and Ben spend the summer with us. They've done some really interesting work, and I'm going to let them walk you through it. So Ben, Max, over to you guys.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Benjamin Lim, and I'm here with...
The conference has been muted.
We're here to talk to you about the role of coal-fired power plants in the Western Interconnection. So I think before we get started, I want to get everyone on the same page. There's a few definitions for baseload, or a few understandings. The EIA defines it as three things. So base load, the minimum amount of electric power delivered over or required over a given period of time at a steady rate. Base load capacity, the generating equipment normally operated to serve loads on an around-the-clock basis, and a base load plant, which is a plant normally operated to take all or part of the minimum load of a system and which consequently produces electricity at an essentially constant rate and runs continuously. And its daily operational pattern would look a little bit like this graph on the right. Sorry to be just reading slides, but we want to get some logistics out of the way. So I want to kind of distill in this that baseload generation, it's not really a requirement, but having a portion of a resource fleet that provides reliability services is necessary. And subsequently, having more baseload generation makes system planning easier, but it doesn't necessarily result in a more reliable or lower cost portfolio. And being completely clear here, coal and nuclear resources are traditionally considered baseload, and that's because they were designed for low-cost operation and maintenance and have low exposure to fuel supply chain issues. And I'm going to let Max introduce you to how we started to look at this topic.
Yeah, thank you. To get started, we use a database called the Continuous Emissions Monitoring Data Database. It's collected by the EPA. Generators report hourly data about their emissions, generation, and fuel input to the Environmental Protection Agency. And all of this is available publicly. It's pretty consistently kept after 2001. So there are over 13 million rows of data just for coal in the West in this system. We focused on coal and natural gas plants in the West, or the Western Interstate Energy Board. So at a peak, there were 96 coal units and 554 different natural gas units in this database. And in addition to handle this amount of data, we used the Python programming language and the SQL database hosting software. Oh, also, these slides will all be available online at the end of this, and there will be a question and answer portion at the end, although we're going to try to get through most of this content, which is why we muted all of you. Sorry about that. Okay, so to look at some of the data that's available in this SEMS database, this is looking at emissions in CO2 equivalents for all of the Western states, looking at coal and natural gas. So as you can see, most of the largest lines are from coal, specifically Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, although there is also a lot of emissions from natural gas plants in California. Also, these numbers are from 2016.
So aside from emissions, we can look at heat or fuel input. On the left here, we have coal heat input in the West, and on the right, we have natural gas. So looking at coal, it's not surprising that Wyoming used the most coal, but I think some people might have been surprised that Colorado also uses a a significant amount of coal as well. And on the right, we can see that California is clearly the biggest user of natural gas in the Western Interconnection. And this is like very, I think, high-level data. It's quite zoomed out, but more interestingly, we can look at how this data looks at the plant or the unit level.
So this is one plant, that specifically Jim Bridger coal plant. And as we mentioned, you can, one of the reasons that we chose to use this database is because of the hourly granularity of the data. So you can see these are really there's a lot of detail in this. Each of those graphs represents over 5,000 data points, so that's a data point for every hour in the year about the heat input and generation at this coal plant. And so you can already see some trends just from this image. Like you can see that in the spring and the fall, there's less generation, probably because of hydroelectric power. But we're able to zoom in further and look at individual units. So these are the 4 individual units at Jim Bridger plant. And this is a capacity factor for each unit for 2016. So some things to note is that units 3 and 4 were off for several months in this year, probably for some sort of maintenance, but also because of less electric demand in those time periods. And so we're using capacity factor. I just want to explain how we derived that calculation. The capacity factor that we're using is one that we calculated ourselves. It's not readily available in the database. But we took the hourly heat input and divided by the maximum heat input from that coal or natural gas unit in the database from 2001 to 2016. We were able to do this with both the heat input and the generation, the electric generation. And you may be wondering why we didn't use the nameplate capacity. And so to clarify that, on that table on the upper right-hand corner, in the 4th row is the maximum generation of each unit. And in the last row on the right, we have the nameplate capacity. So as you can see, the maximum generation that each of these units put out is greater than the nameplate capacity in all cases for the Jim Bridger plant, and we found that this was almost universally true. So this is why we derived our own maximum values for these units. Another thing to note is we mentioned that we calculated this with both the heat input and the electric generation. And so for the coal plants, we are mostly using the capacity factor derived from electric generation. But there is one quirk of this database regarding natural gas plants. Because the emissions database only includes data from emitting turbines, natural gas plants that have both a steam turbine and a gas turbine don't report the electricity generated from the steam turbine. So we don't have a complete picture of the electric generation, but we do have a complete picture of the fuel input. So we use the capacity factors derived from the fuel input when dealing with natural gas plants.
So this study for us, and I guess this presentation, quite frankly, began with the notion that all coal-fired power is solely used for baseload power and is consistently running at max capacity. However, given our preliminary look at the data, we saw that coal-fired power is sometimes used for baseload and running at a variable capacity factor. And, we wanted to set out to prove this hypothesis. And we began by looking at individual power plants. This is an average day in November at Centralia Coal Plant in 2001 on the left and 2016 on the right. And you can see in 2001, this plant epitomized the definition of a baseload plant. It consistently had large generation and a high capacity factor, but in 2016, on the right, we see much less generation and a variable capacity factor with 2 distinct peaks at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. And in some ways, it's representing what California experiences with the duck curve, but this is a coal plant, mind you. So over the years, this is how it changed at Centralia in November. So at the top, we have 2001, And at the bottom, with the two peaks, we have 2016. You can see it was a slow progression through the years, and really just last year it started to exhibit a lot more load-following characteristics and much more variability in its operation. But that's just Centralia. So we wanted to look for other coal-fired power plants. And here on the left, we have Colstrip in March of 2016. And on the right, we have Intermountain in December of 2016. And I want to be clear about what this graph represents is that we took, for example, this graph for Colstrip. It's every day in March averaged by the hour. So it's what an average day in March would look like.
But you're probably thinking these are just 3 examples, and we were thinking that too. We want to have a way to look at all 96 coal plants, all months, all days, over all of the years in our database. And so to do this, we moved beyond just looking for plants that exhibit good behaviors and doing a more systematic analysis approach. So we used a machine learning technique known as clustering. This is an unsupervised learning algorithm, which means that essentially we didn't give a lot of direction to the algorithm, which we think is a unit where it introduces fairness into this process, because we weren't saying what we wanted to get out. We just gave it an input, and then the algorithm does its own machine learning and gives us a result. So we did this with a unit day, which is the, for a single unit, it's all of the generation within a 24-hour period for that plant. So there are over 500,000 unit days for coal in the database, which is what we were focusing on. And so this graph shows, this slide shows the basic question that we wanted to answer, which is how much of these actual generation patterns fit into these idealized profiles. So in the top, we have 2 actual generation days. So this is what the input into our machine learning algorithm looks like. And on the bottom, we have what we expect as the output, which is some smooth, idealized representations of these days. And we want to be able to answer questions about how many days were the entire coal fleet spending in baseload operation or more flexible operation or offline, or any of these questions. So I'll give you an overview of how the algorithm works that we used. It's called a k-means clustering algorithm, if you're curious and can go into more detail later. But basically, when you look at the image on the left, there are 3 groups. And you can see this pretty clearly, and you could break this graph into 3 distinct circles and categorize all of this stuff. But if you start looking at 500,000 data points, and each of those data points, instead of being able to be represented on a graph, is a lot more complicated and has a shape like the unit days that we're dealing with. It's harder for a human to do this, but a computer can do this in the same basic way. So we input all 500,000 days into the algorithm and say how many groups we want it to find. And the algorithm easily identifies these groups. So in this case, we gave it 20 distinct generation profiles. So we asked for 20 profiles. We gave it 500,000 days of operation, and this was the result. So we've highlighted some of these colors. The blue is, I think, the picture that we're told that we expected originally for coal plants. It's either on or it's off. So it's spending most of its time in high capacity factor or most of its time in the low capacity factor, basically 0. The red is patterns that also aren't too surprising. This is either turning on or turning off. The green is what we were really hoping to find. This is clear to us, clearly load following patterns. And the rest that are not highlighted fall somewhere in this mode. They exhibit behaviors of both, but aren't clearly baseload or load following per se.
So this is the output of our clustering. We call this graphic a tree map. And you can see there are many generation profiles here. The size of the generation profile is representative of the amount of time that the coal fleet is spending in that operational pattern. So in 2001, 52% of the unit days in the coal fleet, the whole coal fleet, were baseload generation, and 9% was offline, and the remainder of the unit days were relatively flat. They were those unhighlighted boxes. They were not exactly load following, but not perfectly flat. If we go forward 5 years, 2006, the coal fleet continued to operate mostly the same way. There was a small uptick in offline days, now 11%, and the remainder of unit days continued to still be relatively flat. And another 5 years, and in 2001, baseload generation or baseload operation days nearly halved. You see 27% of the time was in baseload operation, and 14% of the time was offline. And then the remainder, we see more load following days, so a lot more flexible or variable generation. And finally, in 2016, there's a drastic change if you look at the 15-year differences. 22% of the time was baseload operation, 21% of the time is offline, so basically a fifth of the time it's baseload, a fifth of the time it's off, and then there's a lot more load following in that remaining 3/5 of the time. So I think to kind of recap what's seen in those pictures, here's that baseload operation days for coal decreased from 52% in 2001 to 22% in 2016, and offline days for units increased from 9% in 2001 to 21% in 2016. And we find these are pretty drastic shifts in the operational pattern.
So we wanted to do something a bit more than just giving these results. These talk about the aggregate of the whole coal fleet, but we also want to be able to look more closely at individual units. So this can help us answer some more questions, like are all of the units changing, or is it just a few units? Where are all of the units changing? Is it mostly like in the EIM, or is it overall in the fleet? When did most of the units start shifting away from the baseload operation? And then if we could try to look for some correlations and try to explain these shifts with other data. These are questions that we were trying to ask by looking more closely at individual units. So to start looking at the individual units, we asked this question: how many units spend less than 10% of their days in baseload operation? So on the left, the y-axis, that's the number of units in this category. The year on the bottom goes from 2001 on the left to 2016 on the right. And you can see in 2001, there were no units in this category, no units spending less than 10% of their days in baseload operation. And by 2016, we're up to about 30 units spending less than 10% of their days in baseload operation. So if we stack on the units that were spending 10% to 20% of their days in baseload operation, we're doing this in the slightly darker color. So the bottom is still units 0 to 10%, above that is 10 to 20%. And you can see that there are clearly more units spending less than 20% than 10%. Moving up to 30%, I'd like to take a moment to say that since 2011, the majority of coal units, so that's more than 50 of the coal units, spend less than 30% of their days in baseload operation. So that means 70% of the time they are either offline or doing some sort of load following behavior. Jumping up to 50%, so this graph is the number of coal units spending less than 50% of their days in baseload operation. In 2016, 73 out of 84 coal units spent fewer than 50% of their days in baseload operation. And if we look at what's missing from this graph, so this is the unit spending more than 50% of their time, you can see a sharp decrease moving from 2001 to 2016. In 2001, there were 53 units that spent more than 50% of their time in baseload operations, and in 2016, it was only 11. So if we look at the whole picture, this is all the way from 0 to 100, 0 to 10 being the lightest bar, 90 to 100% of their time in baseload power being the darkest shade of blue. You can see that from 2001 to 2016, we've seen much more of the lighter colors, so much less baseload operation in the coal season.
And I think it's really valuable to have all this information, but I think it's really valuable as well to put it in context. So we wanted to put this data on a map so we could visualize it geospatially. And here on these maps, each dot represents a coal-fired power plant, so an aggregate of the units that make up a plant. I think let's point out a couple here. So Centralia is the large dot in Washington in the 2001 map, and Colstrip is the large dot in Montana. And maybe keep an eye on those as I talk through this. To explain how this map works, the size of the dot represents the amount of generation at a given power plant, and the darkness of that dot, or the saturation of the color, represents the amount of time spent in baseload operation. So on the left, in 2001, we have large dark circles, and on the right, in 2016, we have smaller, lighter circles. And I think it's interesting, especially if you look at, two specific plants and see how they change. It's really kind of showing, like, it lends to questions about, what direction is the grid moving in, and why is this happening? Like, if we were just generating less power from coal, what's the cause of that? What is taking up that generation?
So one possible explanation that we looked at is natural gas prices, and specifically, so this is the explanation would be that natural gas is overtaking some of the coal production. And if you just look at natural gas prices compared to our measure of the number of more flexible coal plants, this seems to be the case. So the gray line, that's the line that starts on top on the left, is the U.S. natural gas electric power price, as reported by the EIA. And the blue line is the unit spending fewer than 30% of their days in the baseload generation mode. So this is correlation, not causation, but we think there is, we think that this graph suggests some sort of relationship between these two. As you can see, especially after the 2008 to 2009 sharp decrease in the price of natural gas, you see a sharp uptick in the number of units spending fewer than 30% of their days in baseload generation. And there's also a peak in natural gas prices in 2014. This is corresponding to a slight dip in the number of units spending fewer than 30% of their days in baseload generation. That was also present in the other bars in the previous graphs, from fewer than 20% to fewer than 10%. So to see what sort of effect these prices had, we were asking the question if natural gas units were taking over the baseload operation role from coal plants. And to answer this question, we use the same machine learning approach that we outlined for the coal plants, but this time for the natural gas plants. And as I mentioned before, we use the capacity factor derived from fuel input instead of electricity generation, because we don't have a complete picture of the hourly electric generation for natural gas plants. So the graph on the left shows the total fuel burn in a baseload operation mode for coal plants and natural gas plants from 2001 to 2016. The blue line is the coal plants, and the gray line is natural gas plants. We should know that there's not a direct comparison because natural gas plants burn fuel more efficiently than coal plants. One quad of fuel burnt for coal and natural gas would produce more electricity from natural gas. But you can still see that the overall trend is that the electricity produced in baseload operation in coal plants has decreased dramatically since 2001, while the electricity produced by natural gas plants has increased also quite dramatically. Although the total fuel burnt by natural gas is still less than the fuel burnt by coal plants in baseload operation.
So I think that was one explanation, and I think in accordance with a lot of the grid review studies that have been coming out, market economics for natural gas have been a large driver of why we're burning more natural gas now and generating electricity through that resource. But there's certainly other drivers for the operational shift of coal-fired power plants. We've seen an increase in variable generation, specifically wind and solar on our grid. The aging, less efficient power plants are being phased out, so coal plants are less efficient than the new plants being built, namely natural gas plants. As Max just said, natural gas burns fuel more efficiently. We've had a relatively flat electrical demand over many years, and there's the effect of regional economic dispatch playing into how the variable operations are influenced for coal plants, and then wear and tear cycling costs affecting the economics of each coal unit. So I think in summary of our study, few highlights are that baseload operation has decreased from 52% of coal unit operating days in 2001 to 22% in 2016 in the Western interconnection. Individual coal units in the Western U.S. operating as baseload more than 50% of the time decreased from 53 units in 2001 to only 11 units in 2016. Since 2001, the majority of coal units have spent less than 30% of their days in baseload operation, and offline operation increased from 9% in 2001 to 21% in 2016 without jeopardizing grid reliability. And baseload operation, so the consumption of coal for baseload has decreased by 72%, while the consumption of natural gas for baseload has increased by 145% since 2001 to 2016. And I think, in conclusion to all this, I think we proved this hypothesis that coal-fired power is now sometimes used for baseload power and is running at a variable capacity factor as of 2016.
So we are unfortunately concluding our internship at the Western Interstate Energy Board, but we think there are some future directions for research and some questions that we have left unanswered with our work. One of these is looking at other possible drivers of this change, specifically in wind and solar generation. We don't have access to data about hourly wind or solar generation, but you could use that information to try to explain some of these trends more accurately. We could also try to look more closely at the economics by looking at spot prices of electricity or coal prices in more detail, just to get a better handle on what the economic factors are. And we could also look more closely at the plants that are slated for retirement to see if you can look at trends in operation leading up to retirement for plants that have been decommissioned or plants that are scheduled for retirement, so that we can see how utilities are using these plants and how that changes as they know that they will be retiring a plant.
And with that, thank you all for listening, very patiently, and we'd like to open the floor to questions.
The conference has been unmuted.
So this is Maury Galbraith. I'd like to thank Ben and Max. It's been a real pleasure to have them working at the Western Interstate Energy Board this summer, and they've done a great job on this project. But as Ben said, we'd like to open up the webinar now for questions from the audience. So if you've got questions, please speak up.
Hey, Maury, it's Ron Lair. When you say great work, you guys. That was terrific. Thank you so much for doing it. When you say slated for retirement, all the coal plants are slated for retirement eventually. They all have end dates and depreciation running. So what do you mean by slated for retirement in this
So I think we mean specifically ones that are slated for retirement near term to what we have in the database. So let's say something that's slated for retirement in 2018, we have relevant data for operation in 2015 and 16 to see that, how are things changing towards 2018, and then maybe something that got retired in 2014, we have, data coming up to that. I think units that are slated for retirement in 2030 aren't so pertinent for our study given our data set.
So the question is, what are the operating characteristics of plants that are near retirement, within a few years of retirement?
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
I heard someone else. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Ann from Montana. This is incredible. This is really super useful information, and I like the fact that you highlighted Colstrip. Is there a way to get this presentation before decision makers and the media?
Well, so this is Maury Galbraith. This webinar, we've got several decision makers on this webinar, and so we're proud of that. We're going to make a recording of the webinar and make it available on our website, and then we'd be happy to maybe work with individual states to have targeted previews in their states if you're interested.
Great.
And this is Diane Grinnick. Can you hear me?
Yes, Diane, we can hear you.
Oh, hi. This is Diane, and I'm at Stanford, and Stanford is now established a internship program where we're placing students like Ben and Max, not just at WIEB, but in other agencies. So if there is an interest in showcasing the research, I'm sure Stanford would be happy to help as well, because this is also a real opportunity for our students to engage directly in real life, real life issues.
And to add to that, Ann and Diane, Max, and I have talked about trying to summarize and write a research paper, summarizing this work and getting it published in the Electricity Journal. So I think that is also an avenue we want to go down as well.
Maury, this is Chris from Idaho.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
I am good. How are you?
Excellent. Doing well.
Do you think that it would still be timely if we gave the panel an opportunity to present something at Western Conference in June 2018?
We can certainly consider that. I'm hesitant only because Ben and Max are off to school, and I don't know what their availability is going to be and where their interests are going to lie in the future. But from the Western Interstate Energy Board perspective, I would certainly be happy to continue this work and present this work at the Western Conference, and maybe Ben and Max could join us as well, depending on their situation in June.
I think it would be really interesting as a panel discussion. Yeah, let's you and I talk about it further after this.
That sounds good to me.
Thank you.
This is Carl Zakella from NRDC. Nice work, gentlemen. I wanted to just say it would be nice on these next steps that they have highlighted if we could continue in this line of thinking. This sort of reinforces a lot of what people have been suspecting and reporting on for some time about natural gas prices and the correlation of coal coming into the system. I think there has not been as much known about the other questions that they raised, including the role of increasing variable generation in the bigger picture. It'd be nice to be able to eventually summarize how all of these factors are intersecting, because that is the trend that we're on is bigger than one or two of these variables, and it'd be really nice to have the broader picture. So I really applaud the work that you guys did. Thank you, Maury, for funding it and giving these guys the opportunity, and I appreciate the results, because while they confirm what we thought we knew, it's nice to have more solid data about our region in particular. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. So for those on the call, Ben and Max have been teaching our staff how to use Python and submit SQL queries, and it's a struggle because we're a lot older than Ben and Max are, but we're slowly learning. And so one of the objectives of this summer internship was to be able to continue this kind of work here at the Western Interstate Energy Board, so we're hoping to do that. I see I've got a couple other people with their hands raised electronically, so I want to go to Nick Miller first and then Grace Anderson second. Nick, do you have a question?
Yeah, hi. This is Nick Miller, and again, let me add my compliments to everybody else's great, really excellent work. Two things that I think are probably buried in your answers already that are of interest that you might be able to tease out without a huge amount of work. One is on the ramping of these devices. The change in dispatch is an area of great interest in terms of wear and tear on the plants and trying to get calibrated to how much cycling of various types the plants are seeing. And I think you got all the necessary information to do that. So duration curves or some sort of cool statistical work looking at the average ramp rates or the distribution of ramp rates, that kind of thing, and also the distribution of like duration curves for dispatch, so that you can see, and maybe that's already in your talk, but other ways, so that we can all get a better handle on some of the possible variable costs in terms of O&M and life on the unit. So great work, guys. Thanks.
So thank you, Nick. Some of those issues around ramping and variable operation were included in our original sort of research plan. Again, we unfortunately we only have Ben and Max for a limited amount of time, but those are great areas for future work. So thank you. Grace, you had some questions.
Well, I just want to echo what everyone else has said, that this is seems to be very rigorous and valuable work, and I compliment the presenters on their presence and the caliber of how they created the PowerPoint and presented it as individuals and as a team. Really very effective, and thanks to Stanford and Diane Grunick, others, whoever are sort of creating this opportunity. We've just come through a process where we're defining how we want to spend some of the WIEB funds that are in a slight surplus, and I just would like to nominate this kind of work and possibly these two students for additional funding to answer some of the questions that they've raised that they think are important that they weren't able to get to. I also want to mention that we often do this high-quality kind of analytic work under the state umbrella, but then the industry, the utilities, they will raise questions or they complain that we're doing the work, and I just think we need a follow-up to continue on this project to where we vet the work with the coal utility entities in the West and see what kind of questions they have and what additional work we need to do to continue to solidify the message that comes from this kind of analysis. So I would nominate this work for funding from WIEB over the course of the next, fill in the blank, 18, 24 months. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. This is Maury. We'll work on, as you know, we're still working on getting guidance out to the states for that funding process, and so we'll be in touch.
Yeah, and this is Diane again. Ben and Max are part of a team of a total of 12 graduate, undergraduate students we placed in energy agencies, primarily in California, but also WIEB. And so for some of these other projects, we are also looking at how can we at Stanford, working with the agencies, continue with the research, some maybe with the current researchers, some maybe with other students at Stanford. So, Maury, just keep us posted, but we are looking at the summer is a very short period of time, and if there is interest and support, what can we do at our part at Stanford to then continue it past the summer?
This is Dirk Johnson with the Montana Environmental Information Center, and a good portion of my work is actually focused on the Colstrip plant. I'm wondering if there's more specific data than was presented today on Colstrip that we could get a hold of.
Yeah, we can easily give you some more specifically pertinent to Colstrip analysis for any plant pretty easily.
Somebody's typing and I can't really hear. Sorry.
Yeah, so this is Maury Galbraith. If you could mute your phones if you're typing as we're going, that would help. And so I think the answer from Max is that we do have more detailed, more granular information on specific units and specific plants. If you've got questions and are interested in seeing that information, if you could email me at the Western Interstate Energy Board, I'll be in touch and we'll see what we can do.
Great. Could I grab your email, please?
Yes, mgalbraith, MGALBRAITH, at westernenergyboard.org.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, this is Doug Larson. Sort of a crystal ball question. I know you guys, first of all, great work. I know you didn't have time to look into this, but do you have any insights from looking at the data about whether the cycling of coal plants, whether it looks like the plants that are sort of nearing the end of their lives are being cycled more? That is, we'll run them until they drop dead. Any insights as to whether the data suggests that the plants that are being cycled are those that are nearing the end of their lives?
I think this is why we put that in the next steps. This is exactly the question that we were hoping to address. And I think our intuition and what we've heard is that is the case, that should be the case, but we haven't done an in-depth analysis.
Okay. And along the same lines, let me get your thoughts on whether you think there might be noticeable differences in the operation of coal plants by those utilities who are part of the energy imbalance market and those that are outside of the energy imbalance market.
So I think we looked at this question pretty briefly, but we did not actually have really conclusive evidence. We looked at a handful of Pacific Core plants, and they're part of the EIM. And it was kind of hit or miss. Some of them did have more load following, and then some of them didn't, operated predominantly base load still in 2016. So it was, I think it was hard for us to make a definitive statement about whether the EIM is the real driver. I think the whole concept of regional economic dispatch is affecting it, but I think in like a percentage extent is hard for us to really quantify. I think we do want to look at that question a little deeper, though.
Okay, and if I may, one last question about gas plant data. You mentioned the limitations of the gas plant data. Do you see this as a severe problem for conducting the analyses of gas plant operations similar to what the coal plant operations have been?
Actually, I don't think so, because we can disaggregate the technology of the gas plant. So whether it's a combustion turbine, combined cycle, tangentially fired or dry bottom, etc. We might be able to back into the actual generation, but I think just having the fuel input is a really good driver for understanding the operational patterns of the plant. Like how much fuel they put in is really how they operate the plant.
Thank you guys, and great work.
Thank you.
So this is Maury Galbraith again. One last opportunity from questions for the audience.
Yeah, Maury, it's Ron Lair again. Just to jump on Doug's question a little more, I think it'd be very interesting to look around at the age and location of gas plants, particularly the location of gas plants. I think we're running a lot of gas in load pockets or behind transmission constraints, possibly. I don't, I suspect that, but it would be interesting to weed through and divide up the gas fleet by age and location and kind of technology. That's very interesting. And see what the trends are in terms of use, and whether those, knowing what those trends are, give us a sense of which gas plants are surplus to requirements on the system as we add more renewable energy. And that seems to me to be the coming issue. It's particularly poignant in California, as most things always are, but I think the rest of the system could also use that kind of analysis.
Yeah, no, that's a great point and a great question.
Future work for future summer internships, or maybe some work by some WIEB staffers. But I agree, Ron. I think looking at the natural gas unit data that's in the SEMS, there's a lot of information there, and there's a lot of insights that can be pulled out of that data. Any other questions from folks on the call? So again, I want to thank all of you for joining the call, and I certainly want to thank Ben and Max for a wonderful presentation and a great summer internship. Have a wonderful summer afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining.